Last week's gospel lesson and this week's gospel lesson teach us how to live in community with each other as Christians. In last week's reading, Jesus teaches us a process to use to reconcile conflict between members. And this week, Peter is seeking specifics on how this should be done. How many times should we forgive, he asks. And this probably sounds like a silly question to us, but Peter was asking a question that was serious for him as well as his fellow disciples. The Torah is very specific in providing numbers, times, and specifications for how Jews were to live their lives, and it's natural that these Jewish men would seek clarification from Jesus. What Jesus says to Peter in response is, of course, hyperbole. It's a gross exaggeration of numbers, but the point he's trying to make is that there's a new kingdom at hand that requires only a few deceptively simple requirements. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. The outgrowth of these two requirements is that to love, to have compassion for your neighbor, you must be able to forgive offenses. There's no magic number that you get to where you don't have to forgive anymore. Last week in the introduction to Sunday's morning prayer, Helen Farrer mentioned that there are at least 33 different references to loving your neighbor and brotherly love in the New Testament. And that's a lot, so it must mean that's really important. But guess how many times forgive and forgiveness is mentioned in the New Testament? Well, it's 38 times. So it must be just as important as loving your neighbor. Being a Christ follower means becoming love and forgiveness. And this is a big ask for us, to become the embodiment of love and forgiveness. As I mentioned earlier, this sounds elemental and simple, but the practice of forgiving is much, much harder than it sounds, and you're probably aware of that. The consequences, though, of not forgiving are profound. Holding on to anger, resentment, and disappointment are soul-destroying. It's like pressing the pause button on our spiritual and emotional growth, and it can have life-changing consequences. When I was a young, newly married woman, my mother asked me to do a kindness for my sister. It was something I felt that I could not do, not because I didn't want to, but the request meant that I wouldn't be able to teach my class at the elementary school. My husband and I thought the request was out of line, and I had an obligation to go to work. My mother was angry. She was very angry. So angry that she wrote me a lengthy letter outlining all the ways that I had failed her as a daughter and failed the family. My mother ended all communication between me and my family for more than 4 years, and I was angry enough that I was happy to let her do that. Despite my extended family reaching out to build bridges, I stubbornly hung on to my resentment. So much so that I would often reread her letter to me just to refuel my indignation. It was only after our son was born that my parents and I reached a détente. It was tentative, tenuous, and cautious, but we were able to visit with each other without bitterness, and over time our relationship approached reconciliation. But then my mother suddenly died. We had never made the time or effort to talk through what had happened the years before, and we had never reached any resolution. There was no apology. There was no spoken forgiveness in our lifetime together. When the clearer vision that comes through looking in the rearview mirror, I was able to forgive my mother for having a really, 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 really bad day. But I was never able to apologize to her face to face for my role in the conflict. And I'm so very, very sad that I missed those years with my mother. Working on forgiveness is hard work, whether it's forgiveness with a capital F or forgiveness with a lowercase f. For capital F, victims of abuse, abandonment, or crime, coming to terms with those events will probably require professional help, and that is completely out of my wheelhouse. So let's leave capital F forgiveness to the professionals. Lowercase f forgiveness is something we can spend a lot of time talking about. Someone has hurt your feelings, owes you money. Maybe someone cut you off in traffic, nearly causing an accident. Maybe someone has sent you an unkind email or text. Maybe you feel left out of a group, or maybe a coworker has been unkind. You can probably think of several different instances like this in your life. You may have some that are going on currently. These events, disagreements, and slights can cause great pain and concern, especially when they occur inside a tight-knit community. They interfere with your interactions with people, and if they're not resolved, they can lead to the destruction of group cohesiveness. Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mafo, in the Book of Forgiving, offer a simple fourfold process of forgiveness that all of us can use to resolve conflicts and disagreements. It begins with telling your story about the truth of your pain, what you've suffered, and your resentments. And once you have voiced your truth, you need to name your hurt. This is deeply internal work that may take some time to uncover, and naming your hurt may even force you to go back and revise your story. Only then, after intense personal reflection, can you be ready to grant forgiveness. Can you leave the past and move forward? Maya Angelou said this about forgiveness: you can't forgive without loving. And I don't mean sentimentality. I don't mean mush. I mean having enough courage to stand up and say, I forgive. I am finished with it. When you're at this point where you can stand up and say, I am finished with it, then you are ready to grant forgiveness and seek freedom for yourself. Then the final step is deciding whether or not you want to renew the relationship or release the relationship. And yes, you do have that choice. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation. That's your choice and that's your decision. In my experience, when I have forgiven without reconciling, it has left a deeply sad ache that doesn't lessen with time. When I have forgiven and been reconciled with the other person, the relationship has changed, but in good, healthy, loving, and mature ways. I cherish those relationships where we have loved and been loved by being forgiven for being human. It's the richness of these precious relationships where we love and forgive that the deepest of human relationships are formed. We know that we have weathered the storms and we have confidence and hope in the future. This makes a very strong community. Jesus knows that it's hard work for us because in many ways forgiving is harder than loving. But at every turn, he reminds us that each of us has been forgiven, is forgiven, and will be forgiven. And we are called to do the same for others. Amen.